Kia ora koutou. Welcome everybody. Ko Wadia toko ingoa. I am the founder and chairperson for NATINA, and we are really excited to have with us Paula Jessop today. I will get us underway with the karakia and then introduce Paula and get going with the korero for today. So, karakia te matanga. Manakitia teine hui, manakitia teine ropu, manakitia teine whanau. Tai noa ki teinei kaupapa. Arahina nā korero, arahina nā patai, arahina nā ture nei kia puta ai te maramatanga. So bless this meeting, bless this group, bless this family as we come together. Guide the discussion, guide the questions, guide the intent so that we move on to greater understanding. And this is really, really apt for us today. I just want to say we are really, really fortunate to have you here with us today, Paula, sharing your voice, your lived experience, your journey, and how you've navigated the spaces of healing and growth and personal development, moving away from trauma and onto wellness. So Paula is an autistic woman who advocates for the human rights, inclusion, and acceptance of autistic people and their perspectives in society. She is known for promoting shifts in language and reframing Western perspectives of autism to strengths-based descriptions. And Paula is absolutely passionate about the power of community and how such spaces, specifically neurodivergent advocacy groups, have empowered her own and their collective mental health. So Paula is passionate about, the peer connections and the peer support that really helps us, I guess, to find some common ground, to find support, to find connection with each other, and move towards a sense of healing and community. So welcome, Paula. Thank you so much for coming along today. And I will get us underway with our first question for tonight. So tell us a little bit about yourself and what got you interested in the neuroscience and trauma-informed space. What was it that started you off on this journey?
Yeah, so for those that don't know me, I'm Paula. But I started paying attention to discussions in neuroscience and trauma-informed spaces because it became relevant to me in my personal life and also as an advocate. In the last sort of 3 to 5 years, I noticed that there was an increase within autistic adult communities of adults talking about trauma and speaking of finding themselves diagnosed with complex post-traumatic stress, which is not really a diagnosis as such, but more a description that psychologists use for what somebody's experiencing. So it became quite a common discussion in our world. And at the same time, I was going through much the same. I had a phenomenal mental health breakdown like I've had several times in life. And it was actually a psychiatric nurse that I was working with. I at times have contact with mental health services due to bipolar. And she had actually worked with me when I was a support worker. So she knew me when I was well and succeeding in the world, and she was encountering me unwell. And she was sort of the first person that raised that perhaps what I had left to deal with was trauma. And I think those working in mental health are more trauma informed too now, because the psychiatrist basically said the same thing. I suddenly started getting a message from psychiatric professionals that, in fact, it wasn't what I had, it was what I'd been through. And so yeah, it became very, very relevant to me. I literally downgraded doing everything in my life in terms of mahi work, and became predominantly really focused on sorting myself out, because I think if everybody who knows me in the sector knows that I've consistently had difficulties and I've been quite well known for being quite triggered, easily triggered at times by certain types of language and certain concepts. And um, so, yeah, it became very personal, but at the same time, it's become a collective theme of my community. We are a community of traumatized people, unfortunately, and it's something that we need to start discussing, because our inclusion in the world is not just about accepting our quirky ways.
Mm.
Excuse me.
Well, you're absolutely right in terms of, the trauma, the collective trauma that the neurodivergent community or autistic people as a group often experience because of the ongoing experiences of that discrimination or stigmatization, isn't it? And also invalidation sometimes. It's just so rampant. And it can be across settings, isn't it? So it's not like you um, can get away from the invalidation or stigmatization, and you experience it only in certain spaces. You actually end up experiencing it across, different environments. And sometimes it can be very subtle, but it can still be there even within those interpersonal relationships, family, friends, co-workers. So you're absolutely right about that. Paula, can I ask, what, according to you, are the factors that increase the risk of trauma for neurodivergent people, and in particular for autistic women? I know you've been really passionate about, women in particular. So what are those factors that increase that risk of trauma for our autistic people and specifically for women?
Several things. So the first one is what we experienced growing up. It's a sad reality that even neurodivergent children growing up, in particular those who are autistic, are continuing to experience just high levels of negativity. There's been research that shows that neurodivergent kids just literally hear thousands more criticisms, negative comments. So it all starts growing up. My story maps this. I grew up in the 80s, neurodivergent, autistic, ADHD, learning difficulties at a time when nobody knew about that sort of thing, and they wouldn't have cared if they did, probably. And so that sets us up as teenagers and young people to not have good self-esteem, not have good confidence. We don't feel good about ourselves. We're basically at-risk teenagers, and then we head out into a world which stigmatizes us, is demonizing, is discriminating, and where we enter adult life with further negativity, basically. But now the stigma is stepping up to a level where it's going to affect our ability to gain employment and keep employment. It's going to affect every aspect of our life. Um, so, and then there's another factor, particularly for autistic women and young people, is the lack of social understanding and, our social naivety frequently leads us into situations where we experience abuse. So that was my story, here's a young teenage person that's already does not have a solid foundation of feeling of good self-esteem, of feeling deserving of being treated well, feeling deserving of being loved and respected in the world, then it's a total, complete naivety. I worked with autistic teenagers and they all said the same thing, that they trust everybody until proven otherwise. I was exactly the same. I thought I saw the good in everyone, so I ended up getting abused. And then, of course, by 20, I was fundamentally mentally distressed, and that landed me in psychiatric wards and then Tukanui Hospital. So it was growing up traumatized, experiencing abuse and getting traumatized, and then entering into a mental health system that labels you and pathologizes you and says that you're a bad person. And that journey is still the same for neurodivergent people growing up now. The stigmatizing with diagnosis is greatly reduced to when I was diagnosed 25 years ago. Well, my first experiences of mental health services were the mid-90s, where it was hugely stigmatizing, but that stigma is still there now. So my first experience of societal stigmatization towards people with mental illness was in the mid-90s. So not only was I misdiagnosed with all these particularly nasty diagnoses by the professionals, and they used words such as antisocial, and they said things like she'll end up dead or in jail or in and out of sight. She's broken, she can't be fixed. And then I went back to a workplace where I was referred to as a nutter, a nut bar, crazy, out the gate. And you know what, though, 30 years later, those are still words that people commonly use about me. It is a regular occurrence for me to have a friend or acquaintance casually say that I'm out the gate or that I'm crazy. 30 years I've been hearing those things about myself. My first experience of that, I was 20 years old. I went to a workplace where I was then moved out of a team. I worked in a sewing factory. I was moved out of a team to go and work by myself because people didn't want to work with this girl who had been in the nut house with the crazy people because my supervisor had decided to tell everybody where I was.
Gosh,
And I remember in 1999, I wanted to escape this
gosh,
sort of stigma because at the same time, the stigma occurred almost immediately amongst all friends and family. I was now labelled
yeah.
this fundamentally damaged, mentally unwell person. It was the mid 90s. But then
It
the next sort
is,
of layer of stigma, and this stigmatization continued in my life for 15 years.
yeah.
uh, I was fortunate to be diagnosed in year 2000 with Asperger's, and
Mm,
the professional who diagnosed me is a wonderful woman. She was ahead of her time, and she did not pathologize me. She did not deliver that diagnosis in any form of negative way or say that I was a bad person. She said, "Look, it's a good thing. People like you have these great strengths. See if you can find some others. It's not the end of the world." But I was at university at the time and I thought, okay, right, now we've got a label, we've got something that fits. My parents agree, everybody agrees that this is what I am, this is why I'm having so many problems.
yeah.
And so I took to reading psychology material and it all said that I was disordered. I was just a walking list of deficits. I had communication impairment, I had communication deficits. The word deficit was just used. I couldn't experience empathy. um and so it was all this stigmatizing stuff. But what people don't realize, when you're a person that's put in that situation where the experts, the people that understand people, are saying that you are this thing, is that it fundamentally disrupts your identity. And it's like gaslighting, because I read this stuff and I thought, but I always thought I was really empathetic. It's like I want to save
Mm,
every animal. I can't eat
yeah,
animals because, I'm a vegetarian because I can't deal with eating them. And I've
yeah,
always been excessively, overly sensitive, but they're saying I don't have empathy.
yeah.
So I would be left with this absolute feeling of who am I and what am I and what is the truth and who do I believe? And so, like a lot of other Asperger's people at the time, I embarked on self improvement and I would fix it. But that was also the expectation of everybody around me. Okay, you have this diagnosis. Now it's your job to fix it.
Yeah.
And that carried on. And I have quite a lot of other diagnoses. I mean, now it would be quite common for young people or anyone who's neurodivergent to probably be screened for quite a lot of other things. But for
Mm,
me, it was 15 years of returning to professionals and saying, I'm having trouble. I'm having a lot of trouble.
mm,
And they were people I didn't trust. These professionals were people that locked me in a seclusion room in an institution. So I didn't trust them, but I feel I had to keep returning to them. And it was a mixed bag. Occasionally, I came across people that were not pathologizing, were very kind and amazing.
mm,
But the whole way along, I was constantly sort of dissected and misdiagnosed with things. And we call this medical gaslighting.
yeah.
It's like where your very identity has just been picked apart by
Mm,
other people. And when you try and have a voice and say, well, actually, this is who I think I am, this is what I experience,
yeah.
they say, no, no, you're not correct. So again, um, it's very, very hard to have a positive sense of self and a positive sense of identity and self esteem or confidence, or all these things that people take for granted when you are constantly being picked apart by professionals. But at the same time, you know, for 25 years of my life, I would say it's only stopped in the last 3 to 5 years. I was living in a society that was also listening to these professionals. And
Yeah.
anytime you saw anything in the media, it was these people are disordered, they are tragic, are they destroy families. I was a young person. I'd been diagnosed maybe 5 years ago when Autism Speaks did the whole campaign they did in America. And there I was, this person trying to work out who I was and feel good about myself. And that's what I was getting exposed to in society. I've got a stack of magazines here because of the headlines. I kept them to sort of look at the discourses as they changed over the years. And they say things like inside the mind of people stuck in their own world, the biggest mystery in the world, understanding this condition. And the stories all start with a description of a parent whose life has been ripped apart. And I know that does happen for parents, but when you're the person, the object that's been discussed in this way,
Yes.
it's quite harmful.
Yeah.
But then for me, I did I did a reckless thing in my life and became an advocate. And I became an advocate at a time where that involved more being exposed to
Yeah.
other people's negative ideas about autism. Now I became an advocate because I was fed up. I was absolutely fed up with how society viewed us. I was fed up with how professionals viewed us. And what saved me throughout all this stigmatization was just that I'm internally a real rebel. And it's like if you tell me to believe something or do something, I go oppositional. So the
Yeah.
more they said you are this, the
Yeah.
more I just
Yeah.
went oppositional and said, well, I don't think so.
Yeah.
And I used to do this thing in myself where I used to sit down at night and I used to remind myself of who I am.
Yeah.
Who is who am I that never changes regardless of what the world says and what everybody else says and
Mm.
what the psychologists are saying. So that spurred me to be an advocate, but then I just discovered even more of the same. Now here I was working in this environment where
Yeah.
people were again using these words that we were disordered and we were all these things right in front of me, which that was the big push for a lot of it. That was why we pushed so much to change language.
Yeah.
But what people who don't experience this don't realize is that it accumulates over time like
Mm.
microaggressions. Microaggression is a word that people would probably recognize. When
Yeah.
you're living this existence where from every direction your normal experience is other people having negative perceptions of you and
Yeah.
projecting it at you in some way, whether it's through the media, whether it's the casual jokes that they make about Asperger's people or autistic people, or whether it's the invalidating your experiences
Mm.
or the constant opinions about our ability. Everywhere we go, someone says something.
Yeah.
It's that it builds up slowly over time
The layers is a
into
thing
a
for that.
trauma. So for me, it became this thing where I didn't want to go out into the world anymore, where I felt fundamentally I became extraordinarily anxious being around people.
Mm.
At 45, I was suddenly an autistic person having panic attacks at the idea of being around people or going out into the world. I felt like I just didn't want to try and participate in employment anymore.
Mm.
Um, and I thought, what on earth is wrong with me? I've been dealing with, I've done really, I'm really good at managing my bipolar. I'm really good at having strategies for executive functioning and autism. And that was when the psychologist raised it to me that you're basically now traumatized by people. And what that manifested in with my experience was that I was now living in a state of fight or flight every time I was around people. Every time I was around people, I was in this heightened state of anxiety, just waiting for the comments, waiting for the stigmatizing ideas, waiting for someone to say, oh, you don't look autistic, and I'd become inherently triggered by those sort of comments. I'd spent my life trying to put a wall up and not let it penetrate and think, well, I don't have to take on board all of that. And obviously I didn't. I became an advocate and promoted feeling good about ourselves. So it never completely penetrated, but somehow over time it ended up sort of manifesting and just feeling um, basically having post-traumatic stress type reactions to people, to just people all the time.
And
Um,
Paula, one of the things, that as you've been talking, that sort of really sort of I'm thinking in my head is, all the research is showing now that healing only happens through connections, through
yes,
relationships. It's so important, isn't it? And yet for you, the source of your trauma was those interactions with people.
That's
So it's so hard
that's what's
to
so difficult
do the
for
usual
autistic
stuff.
people in
Yeah.
particular, because there's a lot of groups in society that experience being stigmatized, stereotypes, there's racism. We've got racism and sexism and homophobia and transphobia and all of these, ableism, these things. But you'll find with almost every other group, what they have is other people that can act as a bit of a buffer. So,
Mhm.
let's say they're a disabled person
Yeah.
and, or I don't know, pick some sort of person that tends to get discriminated or stigmatized in society, and they go out and they have a bad day, and somebody, says something really sexist or homophobic or something, and then they go home and they have, typically have some sort of humans in their life, in
Yeah.
their real life, right? They've got some friends, they've got some
Yeah.
family, like some social networks, and they say, hey, this person said this really racist thing, and it made me feel like crap, and the other people say, yeah, that's not nice, that is racist, like, of course you feel sad, that's like not cool. Now autistic people are quite often having these experiences and going home alone, and
Yeah.
going home and they've got no one.
Yeah.
And then we also don't have the same level of social understanding, maybe, or communication understanding. So it gets into, and we can be people that we think about everything. We're accused of overthinking. We're not overthinkers. We're just designed to think. That's what our
Yeah.
brains do.
Yeah.
So we go home, we don't have someone to talk to. We
Yeah.
don't necessarily have someone to validate us that it was wrong what happened to us, that it wasn't nice. We don't have someone to throw in some compliments and go, no, but you're a really great person.
Yeah.
So without having those social networks and those normal support networks, then we're left on our own, alone, to experience these constant
And
experiences. So
and
it's very
Paula,
difficult to deal with.
yeah. Paula, I think the other thing is, I'm a parent, so obviously for me, I'm looking at it through a parent's lens. But, for an adult who goes home, and
Mm.
you may have family and friends, but if those family and friends don't understand you necessarily, then you are not going to get that buffering or that, positive sort of,
That was very much
feedback
my
from them.
experience.
Yeah, about, yeah.
And a lot of my generation did experience that, and still
Yes.
still still
Yeah.
do.
Yeah.
Where then the experience becomes something where we're invalidated, and there's that sense of gaslighting, and that's sadly, I was doing a bit of research recently. I was looking at writing an article about mental health and autism, and there's a bit of quantitative data coming out of different countries, and it was appalling. In every country where they've actually looked at some data of how frequently are autistic people mentally distressed, it was somewhere between 50 to 80% of autistic people. And the mental health distress was anxiety, depression,
Yeah.
and frequently feeling suicidal. But in a lot of these countries, they've got quite a lot of qualitative research coming out, and the qualitative research tells you exactly what every autistic advocate will tell you, and what adults can tell you. The reason that autistic people are fundamentally depressed and frequently suicidal, and you talk to parents of young adults who are autistic, they're in their bedroom gaming, they won't come out, they won't do anything, is the stigmatization and being pathologized and not wanting to be a part of a world that basically treats us like shit. We don't feel like going out into the world and having another person laugh at us. We don't feel like going out into the world and having another person say those comments yet again that makes us feel embarrassed and ashamed to be ourselves. So, you know, it's the exclusion that we experience, which is causing us to be mentally distressed and feel unsafe in the world.
Absolutely.
Um,
Because the constant messaging, obviously, from everywhere around you
yeah.
is, that you're not worthy, that you're not, good enough, or you've got to try harder. And I think the other thing is, when it starts so early, your nervous system literally gets, sort of
Right.
wired to fire in that certain way of constantly looking out for the next, as you said, comment and the next sort of
This is why
snarky.
we have these, so, newer understandings of autism and neurodivergence. We're very aware now of the high levels of burnout and masking and things like that. And that is just so common in my world now as well, is that we've got, and again, it's a sad thing. We've got a group of people that are fundamentally talented, gifted,
Mm.
have strengths that are not common. We could be of great use to the world, but a large majority of autistic people are at home, burnt out,
Yeah.
stressed out, and feeling really bad about themselves.
And
Um,
the messaging in the early years is so critical, isn't it,
yeah.
Paula? Because when you grow up, because the world is not inclusive yet.
Mm,
I hope one day it is really all inclusive, but even if you can grow up in a household with a, real sort of affirming and
mm,
positive sort of, validating environment, and if you have even a few teachers and a few
yeah.
who are, backing you up, who are cheering you on, I think it can make such a world of difference, um, for you to cope with all those negative sort
That's right.
of comments and experiences, in the rest of the big wide world, so to speak, right? And it makes, our adults a lot more resilient then. But
Mm,
for your generation, obviously, you've had it really, really rough. And
mm,
I must say, I really do value and sort of appreciate, the insights that you bring,
mm,
and people like you bring to the table, because it makes us aware as parents that we need to be mindful of how we are interacting, engaging with our kids, the
mm,
words we say, and the way we interact, engage with them, and a lot of little things like, oh, come on, you can do it, like, oh, come on,
mm.
I'm sure you can do this, and we say it very flippantly, thinking we're encouraging our kids, but you never know where or how it's going to land, and so we've got to be so mindful, isn't it? um
It's
yeah,
it's
about the words
difficult
we
with,
use.
I think, next generations of neurodivergent people. There's a balance. We don't. I mean, we have to stop this traumatizing of neurodivergent children. I don't think we have seen one generation yet of neurodivergent young people that grew up diagnosed who aren't starting adult life fundamentally traumatized. And that's usually more to do with experiences at school
Yeah.
and outside of the family than typically the family, right? It's like a lot of, um, and what we're noticing now is families are forming neurodivergent communities. They're wanting to create that buffer. They're wanting to create that safe community for their children because they're aware that that isn't the whole world. And we've got all. I mean, how we've got so many neurodivergent kids now just not even in school because parents are wanting to prevent that trauma happening in those foundational years. But at the same time, we also have this reality that we are sending young neurodivergent adults out into a world that isn't inclusive as yet. And I find that worrying because they don't necessarily have the resilience. So we've got to find this balance with the next generation of
Mm,
neurodivergence. Yes, they need that protection from trauma, but
yeah.
at the same time, we have to build a certain level of resilience or understanding or awareness of what the world is actually like.
Yeah.
And I think collectively, we've got to continue trying to create true and actual inclusion for autistic people and neurodivergent people in
Mm,
society. And you'll notice that I use the word autism quite a bit. It's because I'm a little bit more focused on autism than all of neurodivergence because we've got a real surge at the moment of neurodivergence being talked about, and it's often ADHD that's been talked about, or it's types of neurodivergence where inclusion is what I'd call sort of inclusion light or inclusion easy,
yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
And when I say that, that's not to diminish anybody's experiences, but at the moment, I saw an advocate say recently that anybody who has had a disability plan changed to a diversity plan knows that there is a difference. And I found that very true because there's a lot going on in society in terms of we need to be more inclusive of lots of different groups who are, groups of diversity. But for us, what that is translating to is if you're a neurodivergent person in a professional job who wants to come out and be accepted as a quirky neurodivergent person, that's you're going to get that level of inclusion in certain
Yeah.
spaces because that doesn't if you're a neurodivergent person who is primarily different more than disabled, um, it's easy to be kind and nice and accept that person as they are and their identity. But if you're an autistic person like me that needs actual accommodations in the workplace or needs society to view me as a vulnerable person that needs to be looked after,
Mhm.
it gets a little bit more complicated. And this is something that
Absolutely.
we aren't talking about very much in terms of inclusion
Yeah.
for neurodivergent people. So we can talk about the trauma of stigma and discrimination, which I have tonight, but there's another very real types of experiences which really traumatize us. And those are experiences which are either abusive, where we are physically abused, we're verbally abused, and as autistic adults, we do experience quite high levels of verbal abuse, and that's primarily because people get frustrated and annoyed by our behaviour. You'd be amazed how often people raise their voice and express that. And as understandable as it might be, what it is for us is repeated experiences of people raising their voice and being frustrated at us for being ourselves.
Yeah.
But what's even more serious is that we have situations in life where we're unsafe in
Mm.
the public. So I'll use one example from my life. I was might have maybe 10, 15 years ago, I was learning to travel. Travel is not something I'm great at. I find it particularly difficult sensory wise. It's really full on executive functioning, everything to do with travel. I've got to talk to strangers. There's a whole lot to it, which is very stressful. And I think it might have been most of the time when I was getting flown around the place, I was sort of just delivered everywhere. So I didn't have
Yeah.
to think about it too much. Someone took me to the plane, someone took me from the plane to the taxi. But
Yeah.
this time I think I was negotiating my way home by myself.
Yeah.
And I froze in the middle of an airport, and I don't know what I looked like, but I was just standing there doing nothing, just
Mhm.
in an autistic kind of frozen kind of state of what do I do? Can't think, can't talk, what's going on? And somebody from the airport came up to me and said, are you okay? And do you need any help? And I think I blurted out, I'm autistic, and that was about it.
Yeah.
Now, people in airports, quite a few of them have had training in disabilities and autism, and this person obviously had because he leapt into action and did everything that needed to be done and said, I'm going to take you to a nice quiet place and you can just stay here, and when it's time to get on the plane, I'm going to come back and get you, and then we're actually just going to put you on the plane first in front of everyone else, and everything is good and we totally know how to look after you and you're okay.
Yeah.
Now, that is an example of um, you know, strictly speaking, the terminology we would use is, my human right to safety being upheld.
Yeah.
I wasn't okay. It was fundamentally risky. I was in a public place by myself. I couldn't really formulate words or much. That's actually unsafe. That's an unsafe thing to experience. And through the knowledge and understanding of another person, no
Mm.
harm came to me, and I was supported and looked after and got to where I needed to go. Now, unfortunately, for a lot of autistic people, there isn't somebody there who understands autism when that unsafe situation happens.
True.
And a lot of the time, and we live in a society where people understand the human right to safety and protection of, for example, intellectually disabled,
Yeah.
Down syndrome, different disabilities that they recognize. If they, most people in the public, if they saw a blind woman standing by herself, looking stressed or upset, somebody would probably give her assistance.
Yeah.
Most people in society do not recognize that we are also another group of people
Mhm.
that need to be looked after,
Yeah.
that we need a bit extra from other people because
Absolutely.
we need other people to step up and make it's not just accept us for being weird and different and stop, kind of being mean about how we are, but actually recognize that we're vulnerable
Yeah,
and we
absolutely.
need people to make things safe for us. I've worked with autistic people that can't go anywhere without a support worker
Yeah,
because it's not safe.
yeah,
And that's their
absolutely.
life, never going somewhere without a support worker because it isn't safe. Or
Mm.
in the parent or autism community, something that isn't talked about, there's all the parents that are wondering how their non speaking autistic person is going to be safe when they die. And we
Absolutely.
don't know that they will be safe.
Absolutely.
So, if we
It
start
is
talking about
something
conflict
that a lot
resolution,
of
that's a really,
families, yeah, do worry
yeah,
about. Paula, I love how you've said, you were specifically talking about autism because yes, autism is different from all the other sort of,
mm,
neurodivergent conditions, so to speak. And and there's so much variance, isn't it, in terms of how people
yeah.
need supports,
I mean, that's not
what
to
impacts them, all of that.
it's not to
Um,
minimize, the
no,
experiences of other
absolutely
types
not.
of
Absolutely
neurodiversity,
not.
but maybe more to point at that what is unique with autism is that, a third of autistic people are non-speaking and have intellectual disability. It's just that there's a little bit more, it's not that other people's needs are, don't want to minimize any of that, but I guess it's just that I think, I'm not sure that the general, like within the disability sector and within neurodivergent communities, we
Mm,
all know how complicated this is and that it's very diverse and neurodivergence is very diverse. But the general
yes.
public, I think, is not understanding
No,
that
no.
with autistic people, there are some very specific vulnerabilities and things that we really need. But I guess that's where I think the importance of peer support
Mm,
starts coming in
absolutely.
as well.
The other thing that sort of stands out to me, and I've noticed this as a parent as well, people were a lot more supportive and a lot more understanding and accepting when my kids used to do something or
Yeah,
behave in a certain way or stim or, whatever, their quirky behaviors or sort of
yeah,
out there meltdowns or anything like that. As they grew older, they're
yeah.
not little kids anymore. They're
No,
now
that's right.
men, young adults.
That's
And
right.
people don't always look so kindly or give you that understanding smile or, a little sort of nod of comfort when it happens. And so, and also personally, I must admit, Paula, me myself as an individual, as a person, I have found it very different. I can be very accepting, accommodating with our kids, right? And
Yeah,
it's like nothing, sort of you can sort of, just do what needs to be done and get on with it. But with an adult, you're kind of stuck with how exactly do you respond or what do you do or what's the right way to go about supporting even though I've been in this space for so long.
yeah.
Work as a professional early intervention specialist. I've got my own sort of three kids, with those additional needs. You still wonder. And so I think the understanding education around, how do you best support autistic adults is again not really
No, it's
that
not.
well out there in the public sort of space. And you're right, there's so much stuff around neurodivergence and inclusion and neurodiversity, but it's stuff on paper. It's not the practical stuff, in terms of how do you engage, interact, what can you do?
That's right.
Can I ask you a question, Paula? Thank you first of all for sharing, all your experiences. I know it's really deeply personal, so really appreciate it. But look, how have you, because you've learned a lot in the space of neuroscience and trauma-informed approaches and how to support yourself better. And you've shifted so much, in terms of how you now interact, engage with the world around you, how you advocate, how you, go about your daily life, and also your relationships. There's been so much that you've shifted. And I know one of the things you said, when you used to earlier sort of listen to something and it triggered you and, you
Yeah.
respond in a certain way, react rather in a certain way. Whereas now you can respond, and you can see those different perspectives. So you've obviously been through your journey of healing or
Not
on
really.
your journey of healing, because
Mm.
it's sometimes, takes a long, long time. Tell us a little bit about what has that journey of healing been? What has the journey of, understanding your trauma, unpacking it, and then moving, forward? Because
Yeah.
also I remember you saying that, it was people who triggered you, but at the end of the day, you've got to heal with people in those relationships.
Yeah.
Peer connections are so important. So how did you sort of go about that journey?
I think it's, there's a lot of things. I feel like um, people who haven't experienced sort of significant traumas maybe don't understand how long it takes to undo all of this, particularly the types of traumas that are created by stigmatization. You have to literally get inside your own mind and retrain your own mind, because what it creates in your mind is distrust of humans and society. It creates negative thoughts towards yourself.
Yeah,
It creates all this stuff in your own mind. So you've got to undo it.
yeah.
Um, for me, I've done lots of things, and trying to heal has probably been, the journey for the last 10, 15 years. Um, it, Advocacy was a personal and professional journey. And in that journey, I think the friends that I made and the people I worked with and the inclusion and acceptance that I experienced within the autism sector was the beginning to healing and feeling better, because it was sort of the first time in my life where I could be me, including the aspects of me that are not so great, which are, triggered moments and meltdowns. And I was never evicted from the community. And I've
Yeah,
been around for 15 years, and everybody's seen Paula at her best and Paula at her worst. And I'm still allowed to be here. I got responses. I keep in touch with people a lot online, and that was something that was fundamentally about healing. We proactively formed online communities to try and
yeah,
help other autistic people have a community, to have friends, and to heal. And the things that we got out of forming those online communities was that when we had a bad day, we could go online and say to other people, I had this really horrible thing happen. And other
mhm,
people would tell us that it was a horrible thing to have happen and hope you feel better
yeah,
soon. So
yeah,
we use this term in the neurodivergent world, or the disability world, or the autism sector, whatever you want to call it, of peer support, like it's some sort of formalized thing.
yeah,
And I find, like, when I was getting paid to do peer support
yeah,
and peer mentoring, which I don't and won't do anymore, um, was because what I found was that non-autistic people or NT people who were paying me to work with young people, what they wanted was that I was meant to be a role model and an inspiration, and this is how you end up being the autistic person having a good life.
yeah,
And that wasn't real and it wasn't true. And it's also, there's a bit of a power dynamic with that. If I have to be this person who's an amazing role model. So to me, peer
mm,
support is
yeah,
that we just have friendships. It's that autistic people and neurodivergent people are forming normal communities
yeah,
where people are just friends, where we are, I have friends, autistic friends who are in their 20s, and
mm,
maybe it is the case that they're doing things in their mahi where some of my knowledge is useful for them, and we might talk about that. But I'm
mm,
not their mentor or their inspiration. I'm actually just their friend.
yeah,
And I get something from that friendship as well, which is usually that the younger generation are way more positive than me, and I suck up a bit of their
yeah.
positivity, like um, but so here's one of the things we started doing to heal was forming communities and making that normal, that we hang out with each other and having
Yeah,
friendships. But the other thing that was healing for me was that I was operating as a systemic advocate and working with NT people, professionals, and researchers, and when I succeeded in creating change with things like language and attitudes, that was healing, because I was being validated that our experiences were true.
yeah,
Um, but I also was treated in ways by NT people which I hadn't really experienced, which was things like people would notice when I was not okay by things I said online, And then I would sometimes just go completely offline and think, oh no, out of control.
Yeah.
And people would do things like email me and say, are you okay? Now, I hadn't really experienced people hanging in there and being
Yeah.
supportive and continuing to be friends and colleagues
Yeah.
when at times when I was mentally distressed. So those things were healing, but they're actually just normal human experiences. They were experiences where other humans treated me like I deserved to continue having a relationship even at my worst.
Yeah.
Or that I deserved to have people be supportive and kind when I wasn't having a good time. When I was behaving, instead of being treated as someone who just behaved badly,
Yeah.
um, I got treated as she's behaving badly. It must mean that she's not okay. Um, um, but I did a lot of other things as well. I mean, it's like I work with a psychologist, and it's a blessing nowadays that we have psychologists that are really well trained in autism and neurodivergence, and people that have got multiple sort of neurodivergence
Yeah.
and trauma. So, like for me, I respond quite well to quite CBD type sort of approaches. My psychologist says that she's quite eclectic. She just kind of cherry picks from various
Yeah.
different sort of therapies which she thinks works well for me. The key thing that I find useful with therapy now with someone good is that she's neuroaffirming, that she knows how to talk to an autistic person. She has a positive perspective about us. She respects us as people with strengths and talents and gifts. And she doesn't treat me as somebody who is something that needs to be diagnosed and fixed. She treats me
Yeah.
as somebody who has been through things that needs help to, heal myself because
Yeah.
of very real and valid experiences that I've had. So that the approach of being neuroaffirming in itself
Mm.
is healing. The big thing I think with healing from trauma that people that is underestimated is the power of other people. It's like one person can can fundamentally heal another little aspect from us of us, just by even if they're not going to stay in our life. Maybe somebody comes along,
Yeah.
they move on, but even if it was temporary, I find if any person that comes into my life that treats me like I am, I don't like to be treated normal. When people say I want to treat you normal, I get an
Yeah.
instant fright. I don't want to be treated like everybody else because I'm not like everybody else. I have needs that other people, that are a bit more unusual. I have differing abilities. So my my needs are a bit different to other people. But what I really appreciate and what tends to make me feel healed is when I'm just treated with respect, when
Yeah.
I'm just treated like I'm worthy of being treated with respect, or when I am treated in ways where I'm given compliments, because so much of my life was just criticism. And even therapy is can be quite brutal. Part of fixing self when self is fundamentally damaged involves quite a lot of constructive criticism. You have to be very
Mm.
honest.
Yeah.
There's no um, so those are all things I've done, but the thing that I think was always really powerful for me was other neurodivergent people.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
yeah, it's hard to explain the difference that unconditional acceptance and understanding brings, and that's it's not that we all like each other as neurodivergent people. Sometimes we don't like each other,
Yeah.
but it's that sense of community and like ease of understanding. It's always just so refreshing to be around someone where you don't feel like you have to explain yourself, or when you're not worried that they're going to get really frustrated and react to you in some way where they're angry and frustrated. Neurodivergent people, they don't.
Find, finding common ground, despite all the differences that we might have, is so important, isn't it? Because then you belong. There's
Yeah.
this community that, values you. And even, I think this is the thing, right? Like once you show up healed, then
Mm,
you can accept differences and you can
that's
state
right.
your point of difference with empathy, compassion, kindness, and still be objective and not demeaning to somebody else, isn't it? And I think that's been the most powerful, I guess, benefit for me in terms of working on myself as well, and becoming trauma informed and becoming more self-aware, is when I show up to spaces where I am advocating, where I am, meeting people with absolutely, sort of opposing views. I can still stay calm, hold true in my own belief, and yet sort of, engage with somebody else in that safe
Yeah.
space.
I,
Because yeah, it's just different, isn't it, Paula? Like, it makes a
I
world
mean,
of.
I think people have definitely seen that journey with me as an advocate. Is that now I can be more objective and cope with
Yeah,
difference of opinion. It's ironic that it was, the very professionals and parents and researchers in the sector that I fundamentally disagreed with years ago
yeah,
that were a part of my healing journey, because they were the people that actually taught me that we could come from different perspectives
yeah,
and
yeah,
and fundamentally disagree, um, but either work together for change,
yeah,
um, or agree to disagree.
yeah,
But yeah, one thing that does happen as you heal trauma is less triggering. You become less
yes,
triggered by, less reactive to other people.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
the negative effect of being a traumatized person is it very much does negatively impact your relationships.
yes, it
Yeah,
does,
other
it does.
people, there's a lot that other people won't understand, or it can mean that we might avoid closeness or relationships. So that's probably something that people in the sector didn't realize so much with myself, is that I seem really open, and in all honesty, I don't care about sharing about things of my life. That doesn't matter to me. But those who are close to me are probably aware that it's very difficult to get close to me.
Yeah,
It takes a long time, and people come up against a lot of walls,
yeah,
and that's a very common trauma response.
yes,
One thing I
absolutely.
find difficult in society at the moment is sort of toxic positivity and ideas where able people feel that they just have an ever increasing right to sort of being positive and happy, and don't ruin my good day by, having a tragic life. Um, and the problem for that is that, that's really tough for people who experience mental health distress or disability or autism or neurodivergent, because our lives aren't these amazing positive things all the time. And sometimes our day-to-day life, the things that are normal for us, sound depressing to able people. Um,
Yeah,
so you
absolutely.
sort of our
You know,
very day to day. It's, I mean, parents of a disabled kids know this one as well. That,
yeah,
like most of the time, it's like almost socially inappropriate to talk about the actual life they're living. Um, and so again, it's like people have the power to traumatize us, and people have the power to heal us. And sometimes the most healing thing is just letting people be who they are. And if they happen to be having a really bad life and they're trying to work through everything that's done to them, don't just have an instant negative reaction. Just,
yeah.
um,
Very
empathy
interesting,
goes a
Paula.
long way.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. Look, that toxic positivity, like, I have been a positive person, often. And I remember there have been times where I've been positive about something and I've seen the reaction on somebody else going, exactly what you're saying. And I've gone, oh, this person is not in the space,
Mm.
And so I will shift and I will acknowledge that, hey, look, I get it, how hard it is. And the other thing I've realized over the years is you cannot fake it till you make it, with this
No,
positivity. Because earlier in my journey, that's what I thought. I thought, well, if I fake it till I make it, we're all good. But you can't fake it till you make it when you're healing. And what I've realized is you must acknowledge it, you must feel it. It's almost
Yeah,
like that, that story about the we're going on a bear hunt, and it's
yeah.
you can't, go over it, you can't go under it, you can't go
Yeah.
around it, you've got to go through it. And so that's the thing, isn't it? You have to feel and you have to acknowledge, and then you have to
I think
give that
that's why
trauma
there's
and
so
let
much,
go. Yeah,
yeah,
because
and I
it's
think that's why
somatic.
there's so much burnout within neurodivergent. It's so common for middle-aged neurodivergent people to be burnt out, or neurodivergent people, sort of in their mid-30s. There's these different times where we suddenly burn out. And I know that
Yeah,
certainly for me, the thing that's just brought on a massive bout of burnout and reevaluating my whole life was
yeah,
that I'm Generation X. And I thought that the way that you deal with trauma is you look forward. Look forward, don't look back. That's in your past.
yeah,
Put that behind you and just create a better life. Go forward, succeed. And yeah, that fueled me forward, and I succeeded in various different things. But ultimately, that just pushing everything down and not um, refusing to acknowledge the very real pain and the things that I'd been through, it eventually it just all burst up.
yeah.
And I'm a better person for taking a few years to actually just really look at everything. Like one of the exercises that my psychologist has done with me is things like, well, let's sit down and write down everything you've been through. Just
Mm,
write down everything you've been through in your life and have a good
yeah,
look at it.
yeah,
And then she's like, look at this list. Like most people
yeah,
do not have a life where they experience all of this. Like, no wonder you feel depressed at times.
yeah,
Like, I just spend a lot of time beating myself up for moments of depression when,
yeah,
in reality, they were completely reasonable times to feel quite down, given what I was experiencing and what I'd been through. It's quite reasonable to feel quite depressed when you walk away from a job because you're in a situation where you're being discriminated against and you don't have the mental and emotional capacity to fight for yourself. It's
absolutely,
fundamentally depressing,
absolutely.
And so I'd spent a life having these types of things happen and just constantly saying, okay, fail forward. Let's just bounce out of this situation and make life good again. Now, I have a completely different take on life, which is that my entire life is designed around my well-being, my wellness, what's going to work for me, and what's going to ensure that I don't have the types of, I won't have people that are
Stressors.
disempowering in my life. Like I would rather be. I'm basically a bit of a recluse, but I would rather be alone. If I let somebody come to my house and spend time with me, then it means that I've decided that they're safe
Yeah,
and that they are empowering to me and that they are supportive. Because if they're not, um, and I mean, for me, in my wellness, I really sort of follow Te Whare Tapa
yeah.
um, and sort of go through those different aspects of my life,
Yes,
physical, mental,
yes.
emotional, spiritual, and community. And everything and how I design my life is
Mhm.
around ensuring that I have lots of space to deal with difficult things that come
Mhm.
up, ensuring that I have lots of time to look after myself, making sure that work or mahi that I do, there's certain things that I've just learned to avoid as an advocate.
Yeah.
And putting things in place I actually have things in place now to deal with triggering, which is that there's a lot of people that have me blocked online. That's a key strategy is that friends and acquaintances use proactive blocking at times.
Yeah.
And so there's just all these things I do. It's like, my life is designed with lots of time for gardening and nature and, just anything. It's all about wellness. And most of my work is now, it's about what's meaningful
Yeah.
and all built on my strengths. I don't bother really going anywhere near anything that
Yeah.
doesn't fit my strengths anymore.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, it's a different type of a life, but I'd
Yeah.
have to say I don't regret anything of my life or that I came to this place where nothing in my life is about conforming with society and what society says makes us
Yeah.
feel good, and it's all around well-being and wellness, because your mainstream life in society isn't particularly around well-being and
No,
wellness, is
no, it
it?
isn't. Absolutely not. Um, this has been so helpful, Paula, because there's such a surge now with all the new stuff that's coming out, research around neuroscience, around, somatic approaches. And it's
Mm,
very interesting how you said, you know, you've been using a mix of different approaches.
mm,
And I know when I started learning about somatic approaches, I was like, oh, this is fabulous. Like,
yeah.
somatic approaches, because it's all body up and, but again, I've been thinking if you're just constantly resetting your nervous system through the
Mm,
somatic approaches, you're still not dealing with the cognitive stuff and the emotions and the what's happened. You haven't still processed that story,
right.
isn't it, that occurred, and you haven't rewritten your story. And so I absolutely agree that we need to have somatic, which is body up approaches to healing, and also cognitive, which is your top down sort of approaches, cognitive behavioral, because you have to heal your nervous system, but you also
Mm,
have to rewrite your story and empower yourself, isn't it? And build
yeah.
that wellness around you. It's almost like creating a plan for yourself moving forward. How am I gonna
I think
get
that's why,
stronger and keep wellness as a focus in my life, isn't it?
yeah, and that's why I like models like Te Whatu Tapawhā, because they're also
Yeah.
bringing in, relationships, community, connection with, other people. So I know that I just feel a lot better when I'm doing meaningful things in
Yes.
society, feeling like I'm a part. It brings in, that's what
Yeah.
inclusion is about. But then there's also, that layer of spiritual as well, which is, are you actually living the life, being the person you're meant to be? And I
Yes.
mean, I personally prefer takiwātanga to
Yeah.
autism as a perspective because, you know, I've found in my own life that a lot of the ideas are very relevant. Getting grounded with nature
Yeah.
helps. It's multiple things, and you have to look at your entire life holistically.
Yeah.
Um, and we probably need to do that as neurodivergent people anyway. I mean, I was sort of forced to do that as a traumatized person, but I'd have to say that I look at my neurodivergence in that way a lot too now,
Mm,
where I'm looking at it holistically from every aspect
yes.
of what is it that I need to do
Yeah.
to have a good life. And so, for example, fate made me without a car at this point in life, which actually worked out quite well because for me as a woman, an autistic woman going through menopause, I'd had a huge ramp up of sensory difficulties and it was really impacting my driving.
Mm,
And that was making me feel really anxious. But I was doing the whole Gen X thing of going, I'm not going to lose this skill. I'm going to keep
yeah.
driving. I'm going to be independent. I'm going to keep doing it. And I was just putting myself through hell with this constant anxiety. And now I've sort of been left without a car and I'm finding actually I really enjoy walking. It's like it's good for my body and, it gives me some movement and gets me out of the house. And,
Nice.
um, you know,
Yeah.
it's actually really really working for me, and and yeah, the enforced exercise is fantastic, and
Yes.
it also takes away something else that used to always stress me out. I can't stand having to worry about maintaining cars. I'm like, oh, but maybe some of that is just being middle aged as well. I mean, it's very interesting.
But it's perspective taking, isn't it, Paula? You've now obviously
Mm,
learned, you've healed yourself, you're on your journey to healing, and focusing on your wellness, and it allows you to shift your perspective so that instead of focusing on the negative and why things aren't working out for me, or why is the world sort of so negative, you start looking at the positive stuff and you start
yeah,
focusing on the positive stuff. And I find that that's been a big shift in me as well, because earlier I used to worry a lot about, all the
mm,
negative stuff. And yes, there's always going to be negativity. And like now I say, there's always going to be people who aren't inclusive and who aren't, but
yeah,
I need to focus and work with the people who are inclusive or are wanting
Yeah.
to be inclusive or have the potential to be inclusive. And that's where I can make the change happen. That's where I can,
Yeah.
shift things. So it's so important. Look, I just want to say thank you so much. We've come to the end of our time, and we've got to wrap up, but this has been such a fabulous conversation, Paula. And thank you so much. It's really lovely to get to know you a bit more, other than having your name in the sort of Facebook groups and things like that. It's lovely to get to know you. And thank you for sharing all of this because it's so important. And I think there's such a big message here for not only our autistic adults and young adults, but also our parents of autistic children in terms of what do you want to do? How do you want to set up, that focus on wellness, the positive self-identity, how can we grow that for our kids? How can we make sure they are well sort of buffered and sort of nurtured with all the positivity so when they do go out into the world and experience the negativity, they've got a safe space to come back to. They've got a safe space to, reset and
Mm.
sort of, deal with all of that negativity so they don't end up with trauma in the long run. So it's so important.
Yes, I think that's the point. I think that's why we're starting to talk about it. It's like, how can we need to prevent it happening to the next generation, don't we? Does anyone
Absolutely.
have questions, or it looks like people have got?
Yes, look, I'm more than happy. Shall I do one thing? Shall I close us with the karakia and then we can just, have a casual conversation if people want to stay on, yeah? So I'll end us with the karakia for today. And then yeah, thank you. Thank you everybody for coming along. Thank you, Paula, for all your sharing and your insights. Really do appreciate it. Karakia whakamutunga, kia whakairia te tapu, kia wātea ai te ara. Kia turuki whakataha ai, kia turuki whakataha ai. Haumi e, hui e, taiki e. Amine. I'll just quickly end the recording.